Okay, we're talking about Chapter 10, Discharge of Obligations. That basically means when a contract is done, over, toast. Here's the list from the book. We'll discuss these in turn. This one makes sense. If there was a condition into forming the contract in the first place, or a condition in having performance due, if that condition is not met, then you have exclusive conditions and the further performance is not required. So if David says, I'll buy a camel from you if I'm able to sell my xylophone to get the money, if he's not able to sell the xylophone, he has no obligation to buy the camel. That makes perfect sense. Of course, if somebody during the period of a condition makes it impossible for the other side to perform, the other side is excused from that performance. So if one side prevents the other side from helping her move, for example, then Jimmy doesn't have the obligation to move, and he can recover because Sabrina has actually materially breached the contract. Anticipatory breach is a doctrine that came about because originally one had to actually complete the contract before they could sue. So anticipatory breach basically says if somebody tells you they're not going to perform, you can sue then. You don't have to wait until the time that performance comes due. If they say they're not going to, you can take them at their word and sue anticipatorily, saying that they've told you they're not going to perform. So you don't have to wait until they actually breach. So, for example, if Encyclopedia Britannica was sending you a volume of an encyclopedia a month, but they went out of business and told you they were going to stop giving you anything after the letter P, you don't have to wait until all the way until Z would have arrived to sue, or until P was due. You can sue right then. There is voluntary disablement when one party voluntarily does something that makes it virtually impossible to fulfill his own obligation. So if Encyclopedia Britannica sells this business to an internet publisher without telling you if you're going to get the next volume, they're basically saying they're going to breach by virtue of their conduct rather than actually telling you that. So it's another way of saying anticipatory repudiation by conduct. It's different from performance prevented because in the performance prevented example, the person made the other side's performance impossible. Here, they're making their own performance impossible. So what do? You sue them. And you don't have to wait to sue them until the time has passed for performance. You can sue them because they have voluntarily made it impossible for them to perform, and they're basically telling you they're not going to perform by virtue of their conduct. Performance. This makes sense. If you perform your part of the contract, you no longer have to perform. There's another concept called substantial performance. And what that says is if you do basically most of the job, you no longer have to perform the complete amount, but you're not entitled to the full amount of money. So if Joe was hired to clean leaves off the roof and he got 98% of it done, then quit, believe it or not, that's enough for him to get paid 98% worth. He has substantially performed. He is due his money, even if he hasn't completed the job. But you have to subtract the portion that he didn't complete. Typically, substantial performance is going to be for something that is at least 75 to 80% done, and maybe even higher than that, to make the case for performance. Breach of contract. Well, that's definitely a time when the contract is over. The way you look at it is you basically have to decide, did one party materially breach? That's the key word, materially. And that means a lot. If one party materially breaches, the other party can suspend their performance and has an immediate cause of action, i.e. they can sue. Now, see how this can be troublesome, because what if the other party says, oh, we only did a minor breach. You don't have the right to sue. The contract is still in place. Then you have litigation around what is a material versus what is a minor breach, and that's the nature of the discussion that takes place. Let's look at some examples. Let's say Derek was hired to put up a post office box stand in his neighborhood. He totally failed to do it. Well, that's clearly a material breach. What if he painted it yellow instead of blue, as he was supposed to? Well, that's probably a minor breach, but you can see how the arguments could fall out from that. So only in the case of a material breach can you cease your own performance and then sue the breacher. Agreement of the parties. The book lists 6 different ways that parties can agree to end their contract. Mutual rescission is the idea that you can turn back or agree to let go of the contract when it is executory. That is, when neither party has done anything. So let's say you've got a joint venture formed between 2 partners who are going to sell dog biscuits, but they haven't done anything yet. They've just talked about it. So they say, let's sell dog biscuits together. And they say, okay, so then a contract is formed. Well, actually, let's not. All right, fine, we won't. So that's rescission. So that's changing, going back, starting from scratch. At that point, the contract is executory, so neither party owes either party anything. This obviously doesn't work completely when the contract is partially executed, because at that point the parties have changed their position and something needs to be exchanged to make them whole again. You could have a release. We see this on the news all the time. Famous coaches, they were hired for $9 million per year, and then they have a private settlement where they say, okay, I'll leave if you pay me $3 million. They take a chunk of the money, and it's a settlement. It's an agreement that something didn't work quite right, but somebody's entitled to something, and it's a way of negotiating out the agreement. It's called a release. You can actually find examples of that on the web. Accord and satisfaction. We've talked about that. That's a situation where one party says, hey, we have a dispute. I'm going to pay you X. If you cash this check, X is all you get. And then the other party cashes the check on full notice of the argument and in full notice of the fact that it's an attempt to settle the debt. And then that is effectively a settlement and a accord and satisfaction. So in that case, there's another way the parties have agreed to end the deal. Substituted agreement. When we did some negotiations, you guys ran across this where some people said, well, fine, okay, the old deal didn't work, you didn't perform, we'll just form a new deal and we'll incorporate the terms of the original deal into that, and that will take care of it. So it's a substituted agreement, it's making a new deal and resolving the old terms. Novation. That's a situation where somebody says, hey, I want out of this contract, and the other party says, yeah, we'll let you out of the contract if you put X in. And so a new party is substituted to receive both the benefits and the obligations of the contract, and it lets one party off. So novation is only where the parties agree to substitute a new party in completely for the old party. And modification, that's really common. Let's say somebody says, I know I'm supposed to deliver milk to you for $2 a gallon, but actually milk is now costing $18 a gallon. I'm going to breach and you're going to have to sue me, or we can maybe modify it to take into account the new changed circumstances. If the party agrees to modify it, then they've resolved the dispute, and by agreement of the parties, that original contract is no longer binding. Impossibility. A lot of people actually think impossibility is used more frequently than it is. It's a pretty rare situation. Basically what we're talking about is where the parties contracted and they didn't actually think that something might happen, and so they didn't contract for the risk of an event happening, and then it happens. Maybe the contractual duties are discharged. So for example, if you drill for a basement and you hit water, and it becomes impossible to do the basement, if the parties didn't contract to who was going to take the risk of that, then contractual duties may be discharged. If they thought ahead and actually put the risk into the contract, then there is no discharge. There's a couple different lines of cases, and sometimes the doctrine is called impracticability, to recognize the fact that some things are not impossible per se, but they are impracticable. That is, it's going to cost way, way more money than was expected. But keep in mind, if the risk of is being allocated, then you can't get out of the contract. This is a tough one to win, a very tough one. If you're if you're in the party who needs to use this doctrine to get out of a contract. Here's a quote from one case. Impossibility means not only strict impossibility, but impracticability because of extreme and unreasonable difficulty, expense, injury, or loss involved. So if you underline extreme and unreasonable, that will help you see the standard that has to be met. It's pretty high. The classic example is where a musician promises to play a concert at a specific concert hall, but that particular concert hall subsequently burned down. It would be impossible to perform according to the contractual agreement, and the musician would be excused from performing at that particular venue. At that point, a modification of the contract would probably take place, and a new venue would be reached, or the musician would be let off the hook for that, and maybe may have some other provisions for compensating them for the loss of the opportunity. Here's a case I remember from law school. There was a contract for a party to buy natural gas at $7 per cubic foot or whatever it was, but natural gas is now worth $29. So in that situation, the seller is going to take a serious loss if they perform the contract. Held. That's not impossible or impracticable. It's just more expensive. The parties cannot get out. The party cannot get out on the basis of impossibility. Supervening illegality. Well, we've seen that one before. Remember that we talked about supervening illegality when we said that if something becomes illegal at the offer stage, that can kill an offer. It can basically automatically legally terminate the offer and make it not effective anymore. Make it so that it cannot be accepted. Well, the same thing comes true when you're in the performance phase of the contract. If Joan contracted with the city to hunt the coyote that lived in its park, and then the county declared the hunting coyotes as illegal, Joan is discharged from performing the contract. She no longer can do it because of supervening illegality. So really, this is just taking supervening illegality and moving it down the time of performance a little bit. Okay, so the book talks about death of the parties or destruction of the subject matter. We've seen this again before in the offer context. We've seen that those things can automatically legally terminate an offer. Well, again, in the performance phase, if they occur, they can end a contract. Now, the parties may be able to contract as to the consequences of something like this, but it may suspend one party's obligation to perform. Here you'll see my love for the Olsen twins, Kate and Ashley. They signed a deal to be the faces of Maybelline. Unfortunately, they died in a ferry plane crash. This is not true, of course. Obviously, they cannot perform their end of the deal, so their obligation is suspended. Now, you can imagine a situation where, let's say they were found to be taking drugs or something. Because that's their fault, other clauses of the contract should be dealing with that, so they may not be able to suspend their performance of the contract. In fact, Maybelline may want them to suspend their performance under the contract, and then the Olsen twins would have to pay some money to compensate for their drug use, which was in contravention of the contract, we're imagining. Frustration of purpose. Frustration of purpose is kind of like impossibility. It's just subtly different. And really what we're talking about here is where a supervening event made the whole reason for contracting no longer important to one of the parties. The classic example is the king. Somebody contracted to rent a hotel room so that they could go watch the king parade down the main city street. Well, the king got sick and he was not going to perform, and so there was no reason for the party to rent the hotel room anymore. And they were able to use frustration of purpose to get out of the deal and have no liability. Now, this can be contracted for. You can have clauses and you can assign the risk of these things contractually. But the basic doctrine is something that parties use to try and get out of performing because they no longer have the purpose of doing that thing. So is this frustration of purpose? This is a real story. I bought tickets to a luau in Maui, and then I decided to go to Mexico instead. I wanted to argue frustration of purpose as a defense and get a refund. The risk of loss in that case was allocated. This is not actually frustration of purpose. This is just me changing my decision as to where I want to go. There was no intervening event that made it unlikely for me to go to the luau in Maui. So that's not frustration of purpose. Now, the party that held the luau let me out of the deal, which was very nice. But frustration of purpose in that situation would be more like if there had been a hurricane that made the luau impossible. There's no sand to bury the pig in, so we can't have a luau. So no, that's not frustration of purpose. Okay, the OWBR versus Clear Channel case. I really want you to understand this case because it has a lot of important provisions in it. A lot of things that we've talked about are in that case. You need to answer these questions for yourself because this could easily be on the test. Was the liquidated damages clause where the plaintiff sought $625,000 held to be a penalty? Remember, we talked about liquidated damages clause. And we said you can use them when it's difficult to assess the amount of damages. Sorry about that, the phone rang. So basically, $625,000, you can have liquidated damages if it's not a penalty and if it's difficult to estimate the actual damages. So I need you to answer that question when you read the case. Second question, I want you to consider, how is a force majeure clause similar to frustration of purpose? Does it actually allocate the risk of what happens if there's an act of God, which is what force majeure basically means. Also, the court said this concert that they were talking about may have been economically inadvisable, but that is not what the force majeure clause was meant to deal with. The court said essentially market shifts are not sufficient. The court in that case shows us just how hard it is to come up with impracticability as a defense to try and get out of a contract. The court said that a contract becomes impracticable when its performance becomes excessively and unreasonably difficult or expensive. The contract must be positively unjust. The court ultimately held that the defendant didn't prove September 11th made the concert inadvisable. Please understand that case really well. And that's it.